Can you hear me now? Gratefully relocated, beautiful community. Have we successfully started a second go, or am I still silent? Let me know if you can hear me, everybody. Sounds okay. You can hear me. Fantastic. So, vaguely, I've made a note of a couple of questions I noticed. So, Julia was asking, could we abolish social media? And there's a tradition, and I know it's not a serious question, but there's a tradition of green thought, which risks ending up in a place that tells us that we can control technology. And the trouble is that we can't control technology. Often, a Luddite thought is a healthy idea, but to take it from personal choice to something a society does altogether requires a certain magical picture of who might be that we that chooses against technology. And as soon as we get to that we realize that there is no such we with adequate agency to abolish technology. You know, we often talk about how democracy isn't globalizing, but there are some features of globalization that are rather inexorable, and the transformation of society by technology for better and worse is one of these things. So it's a very healthy Luddite thought, but there is a history of us being too magically invested in it being possible, when in fact it isn't. There was a question about democracy, about whether democracy is any one thing, and I've forgotten who asked it. And it's a good question because we always need to think about what it is that holds a certain concept that we use together. Much of the time, what we'll end up saying is that there are certain universal features of human life that are expressed in very different ways in different cultural circumstances. Very often when we talk about ethical or political concepts, not always, but very often, we're talking about concepts that have certain universal features or universal concerns that then get differently articulated in different cultural circumstances, sometimes very radically differently articulated. Democracy is, I do think, a concept that's coherent enough for us to say that it's not just a word attached to a set of completely disparate social expressions. So it's a thing. Wittgenstein came up with the idea of family resemblances. So the thought might be not that you can give an analytically transparent definition of how these 77 instances all fall under one and the same concept, but that you can say that all of these things have a certain kind of family resemblance to one another. A shares something with B, B shares something with C, and on that chain goes. That's also quite a useful concept when we talk about the social world, when we talk about political ideas, the idea that things might have family resemblances. I would be very slow on definitions because none of us here could even define what a cat is um, in a way that is entirely definite. I think historically, it's only in the last couple of 100 years that democracy is overwhelmingly not a swear word. And I do think that the way we think about democracy goes in two directions. We've talked about this before. One is a kind of a prosaic idea. We all tend to think that if it's a democracy, you've got to be able to kick your government out. If it's a democracy, you've got to be able to have a modicum of free speech. You've got to be able to write an article without getting arrested. If it's a democracy, you've got to be able to go to court and have a chance of winning, even if the government isn't interested in you winning. But then over and above that, there's a richer, more contested idea of democracy. And there we always see ourselves drifting closer to it or further away from it historically. And at the moment, we're witnessing a democratic recession where we're drifting further away from it, and we'll continue to do that for at least a quarter of a century. That's inevitable. You can just see it by the tide. It's not going to be reversed in 7 years. So even in these more contested terms, I do think that there's a sense in which we're talking about one and the same thing. And part of the evidence for that is we often agree with observations such as, oh, that country's become more democratic. Oh, that country's become less democratic. And we can agree on that without agreeing necessarily on either there being a definition to capture what that means, or even there being a shared account of what that means. But people who don't share a conception of democracy will very often still be able to agree, oh yeah, there's genuinely democratic backsliding there, there's genuinely democratic progress here. Piotr, it's very important not to blame Russian interference on our democratic decline. You can blame it to a degree of 2%, but not much more. It's very dangerous. And I'll mention that in the latest main channel video. I'm doing a little experiment. I'm going to see what happens if I release a main channel video that takes me a few days rather than a month to make. So it's going to be much, 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 much less well edited than the last one, which is the best video I've ever made and the least watched, which is predictable for various reasons, partly the topic, partly the phase of the community and the algorithm. And I'm going to try to get, unfortunately, I'm going to put myself in a position of getting slapped in the face by the algorithm again with this next video, but it'll be repetitive yet fresh and important. I think it's too ambitious to say I'll share it tomorrow, but probably Monday. So 90% Monday, 10% tomorrow, and I'll keep you updated. Ferrari guy. Yeah, I sort of had to go to answering your question. There was a question about democracy and terror. Jessica's in Paris. Wendy's saying my comedy was rather cringe. I thought it was really low quality comedy on the chat channel. And the quality I thought was so low that it was a moral disgrace. Oh, Peter is saying you blame Russian interference for stream interruptions. These Russians are weird. Because since the war, the people they've been coming after in Europe have been so bizarrely selected. Partly that's because I think they have very big lists, and if they can't get the top people, they keep going down and down and down the list until they can do something terrible to somebody. Thank you, Schofield. I think you had a question, Schofield. I don't remember what it was. Neil, how do we have democracy, though, when democracy is institutionally national, when technology and communication is global and is easily exploited by democratic and totalitarian? Look, our lifetimes and in the lifetimes after our lifetimes and on and on and on and on, we're not going to transcend the nation state. So it's the only democratic vessel we've got going. And if we lose it, it's because we don't have something better. It's because we've just lost it. And the trouble is that as we're losing trust in our democratic institutions inside nation states, we're also losing trust in certain forms of cooperation between states. So, for example, a key expression of democratic decline in Europe is the feeling a lot of citizens have they don't trust the European Union. They just don't trust it. And very often that takes forms that we can empathize with, but that aren't easy to translate into agency. And very often these reactions end up being rather incoherent, if understandable. But nevertheless, they're there. And so one feature of democratic decline is that we're skeptical of certain deep forms of interdependence between states. That's quite aside from the fact that, as you're pointing out, there are all kinds of bad people out there, like the Chinese or the Russians. But what we've got to do, bad people in terms of geopolitics, but what we've got to do is focus on possibilities for cooperation when they're there. So a very important question is, what can we do with China on AI? Because there are arguments to be made that despite us being in a Cold War with China, that we can agree on some things about that. The other things we can't agree on easily. And the single biggest global challenge we face, in my judgment, that's the climate crisis, requires a kind of collective agency that's just not available. That's 2 cents. You deserve a couple of dollars in answer to that question because it's so important, but that's 2 cents. I think there was a question about the US transcending Republicans and Democrats. And my answer here would be pessimistic. That's to say that if you find that in 20 years the United States has transcended these two political parties, then the odds are that that's because US democracy has collapsed, not because US democracy has improved. So as bad as things are, my story is still a story of resuscitation of the main parties. And my prediction is that if they're transcended, that's more likely because of something bad happening rather than something good happening. Accountability versus trust. Let me have a look. What is my definition of the political? I think that you don't get a definition of the political, but there is a video on the philosophy channel about it, sparkling soda, right? I think there's a video on the philosophy channel about it. Something like, what is politics? The key contrast I keep making when they say we've got to get political about this, we've got to get political about that, is against an understanding of politics that one might call political moralism. That's to say, to think of politics in terms of an application of moral principles to the political sphere, which apply elsewhere anyway. I don't believe that. I think that politics brings with it its own special morality. And I believe that certain questions are absolutely central in politics. Questions of power, questions of agency, right? And 78.32% of our political discourse ignores these and focuses instead on expressive rather than effective dimensions, right? So let's put it bluntly. There's a whole bunch of people going around saying how all Russians are guilty for the war. Well, I happen to think all Russians are responsible for the war, just like I happen to think, I don't know, all Americans are responsible for everything the United States does, everything United States allies who are heavily dependent on the United States do. But that perfectly correct point, unless it talks about guilt, which would be completely wrong, but if that perfectly correct point that all Russians are responsible for the war, 90% of the time when it's expressed is unconstructive. It takes the place of what should be the agitation of the Russian political space, trying to pit Russian political forces against each other, trying to insert into real political life certain pictures that bring Russian political actors closer to having make certain choices that change the situation and so on, right? So one such move would be for us very clearly in the West, and for Ukrainians to declare what we want to see happen on the Russian space and how we'd respond if it happened, which would encourage some folks in that space to move toward that, blah, 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 blah. So the more effective story, and then there's the more expressive story. There's nothing wrong with expressive politics. I happen to be personally low on expressive politics. It doesn't appeal to me personally, but I believe it's important. It has a place. What's a problem is if it replaces effective politics as opposed to joining in alongside it. Leopardi is talking about how the conversation about Israel and Gaza is in certain circles getting too civilizational with too many religious overtones, and Leopardi is suggesting that's happening in conservative circles. Is that anathema to democracy? No. Any conversation that doesn't directly threaten violence is not, in the first instance, anathema to democracy. You've got to be very sort of low on what we call anathema to democracy, because we run the risk of saying that here's a list of what's anathema to democracy, and we end up just talking to a group of people we like, which is 11% of the population. We don't want to get that. So we're going to keep that definition in quote marks, minimal. There's all kinds of ways of being sort of toxic, producing tension. I mean, there's a good example recently in British politics of the a statement that the Home Secretary made, which provoked tension between different groups that are taking action on the street. That's toxic upon democracy. But it's just toxic. We don't want to say that it's just completely incompatible with democratic life. Democratic life contains stuff that threatens democratic life. There is no magical sort of way of insulating democracy from generating threats to itself. It's just that they mustn't get too deep. That's how I'd begin to think about that. Philip, is immoral behavior from an opponent a blank check for endless violence in response? No. I believe that our story about what it's okay for us to do should not be dependent on how many principles of what's okay and what's not okay to do our enemies violate. If we're talking about interstate stuff, if we're talking about stuff internal to a state, this is very hard, and then you might be raising a very important paradox. Oh, I think somebody's going to be Hey, Neil, I think you might get banned any moment now if you're saying that I'm a Hamas mouthpiece, because I don't believe you can believe that because of the clear plural statements of condemnation I've made about this. But there's a small chance that I'm misunderstanding what you've said. So I'll see if you make another comment. But if you make another comment like that, you are gone. Simply because you'd fail a lie detector test on this. Now, the difficult thing that the question I'm answering takes us into is this idea of what if our opponents are behaving in such a way as to treat us as enemies, but we're stuck with them in our society. And on the one hand, it's outrageous that they're doing that. On the other hand, it's typically not productive to treat our opponents as enemies, even though they're treating us as enemies. That's a very difficult paradox. How do we not treat people as enemies who are treating us as enemies? And as our democracies become more polarized, we're going into this challenge, unfortunately, waist deep. Island Man, I'm trying to answer only ethically driven questions. So I'm only going to share a sentence about this, if that's okay. Have you watched Trump's cognitive decline? China is further behind in AI than you might think. I don't buy their rhetoric about it. Thank you for your awesome work. Love from USA. So my view is that allegedly, it might be speculated that, and I'm going to say that I have much more certainty about this than I'm making out, but allegedly, it might be speculated that Trump's got two things going on. A narcissistic personality disorder combined with very significant ADHD, which it seems requires also an interesting conversation about whether and how regularly it's medicated. And it can happen to some people that if you have something in the ballpark of narcissistic personality disorder and you also have ADHD, that can fuel it. And therefore, almost all Trump's speech interruptions, almost all Trump mixing up country leaders, is that not cognitive decline? So I don't believe Trump's experiencing significant cognitive decline. I think he's got a neurodiversity plus narcissism interaction that's often making him speak in ways that are very strange. I'm just holding my microphone tremendously strongly, and some big bad leaders are out there. Some of them are very beautiful. I'm very beautiful, and it's just great to be here. Very, very good man, the leader of North Korea is. Had a beautiful breakfast today. That's not cognitive decline. And I'm probably going to have a separate episode on Biden and his cognitive issues, which is important to discuss because it's important to distinguish them from his decision-making capacity, which in my judgment isn't affected by the cognitive issues he's facing. But for me, that's my take on Trump, but I want to skip back into ethics. We might not go very long today because I am preparing this under-edited main channel video, which I think is important, but we'll see how it goes. Cheryl, no, Biden's stutter is not a significant factor in what I'm talking about. So I do factor it in because it's real, but that's not what I'm talking about. Miko is talking about religious fanaticism. So what's fascinating is that there are religious fanatics on both sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no doubt about that. But, and they're different in type, but they're there. If you're talking about other conflicts and you want to talk about Russia, Ukraine, then what is driving that conflict is, interestingly, a kind of thing that I don't call an ideology, but I call it a kind of mystical vision, which is strange to us because we don't think that really should start wars in the 21st century, but it does. In other words, it's age old, it's stuff that doesn't go anywhere. So I think on the one hand, you have religious fanaticism playing a role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On the other hand, you have mystical fanaticism of a certain kind playing a big role in Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. It's a certain kind of mystical vision of a confrontation between a fake Russian civilization, sort of fakely defined by Putin and whatever it takes the West to be, and that confrontation is inevitable. And this inevitability story is really important. It's not that Putin says, I'm going to do it. He thinks, I'm going to do it because it's inevitable anyway, this confrontation, and we have to play it out, live it out. And that's very disturbing because, of course, the trouble is that people who have these mystical visions aren't necessarily dumb and aren't necessarily devoid of rationality. So they can ask very robust questions about the world, about their opponents, while still remaining committed to these mystical visions. Mike, great to see you. And you're just throwing out a question. Do you give any credence to the criticisms that are being lunged at the academy, specifically the problem of ideological capture and declining academic intellectual freedom? Yes, I'm very concerned about that. I feel that deeply. As far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict goes, my strong suggestion to any academic institution, it's a suggestion that will fall on deaf ears, is academics can make political statements, and my openness to what they can say is this wide. You can say whatever the hell you like, as long as you don't stoke up violence in anything like a direct way. But the only real way for academic institutions to have a meaningful political voice is for academics to have that voice, but for academic bureaucracies to be silent. I do not want a president of a university expressing sympathy with Israel. I do not want a president of a university expressing sympathy with the Palestinian people. I do not want an academic department or any upper bureaucratic echelon of an academic institution expressing either a sentiment I like or a sentiment I despise. To that extent, it's bullshit that the universities can't stay out of politics. They can stay out of politics. And I don't want a university bureaucracy to say anything good or bad from my point of view. And I'm equally offended if they express a view that happens to be my own. It's outrageous, deeply unacceptable, and existentially damaging to higher education institutions, because they're going to be chased out. They're going to be chased out from a position of legitimacy by unlovely politicians for doing that. They'll use that as an opportunity. So the bureaucracy stays neutral, and then academics can say what they want. Professor Susan can put an Israeli flag. Professor Samantha can put a Palestinian flag on their door. I'm in love. But I'm not in love if the bureaucracy says this. So there's a wider conversation, Mike, that we should have, and I'll try to have, about fashionable nonsense taking over university bureaucracies and prescribing certain ideological visions. And I think identity politics in its latest incarnation plays a big role in making that a problem. And I also think that higher education institutions are failing young people at the moment because we're pumping out young people who are not properly equipped to engage in conflict constructively. We're pumping out young people who want to cancel their political opponents. We're pumping out young people who believe that they can choose who they share the table of politics with. And it's scary. I mean, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, quarter of a century ago, kids in undergrad degrees were being taught how to engage in conflict effectively. And that's another risk. But the basic answer to your question, as far as certainly the Middle East crisis now goes, for the life of heavens, please, university bureaucracies, do not say anything about politics, no matter how noble it might sound to you, and no matter how much I might agree with it. Indelible hi, and thanks. I'm going to butcher you, but Rhoda Bergis is asking, do you think the ethical questions concerning Israel-Palestine are separable from the logical questions? No, they're not. And yes, they are. And this is so complex, I'll just give a couple of quick thoughts in each direction. One way they're not is that the thing that I came out with right at the beginning of this story, because I felt it was so important, was that justness of cause for war has no effect on the expectations the world should have of you to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. And so that's an ethics that applies no matter whether what you're doing is militarily justified or viable, or unjustified and unviable, right? Now, as we retreat from politics a bit, and we make ethical observations about politics from outside politics, it then becomes easier to say things like, yeah, of course, there is a connection between the viability or futility of an enterprise and the ethical wrong of killing civilians in the process, right? So if you think that Israel's ground invasion of Gaza will prove futile, if you think that a large-scale invasion of Gaza by Israel will prove futile and counterproductive, which is a view I'm sympathetic with, then from a position of ethical judgment outside politics, quite certainly you can say, yes, this makes the pulverization of civilian life in Gaza less ethically acceptable than it would be if Israel could realize some strategic goals effectively there. Now, I'm not saying it would be justified in that case, but I'm saying that the degree to which it's justified or not justified is connected, right, to the viability of the enterprise, at least from certain ethical vantage points. But the more we get into politics on this issue, the more I'm inclined to then try to detach again questions of justness of prosecution of war from questions of justness of the war itself. This is 1% of the answer you deserve, but the basic point is there are going to be there are absolutely going to be some connections. Alan is saying, I've noticed in terms of interviews in Gaza, that many of the public have the opinion that the religious leaders give them. Here we need to go to experts, and this is not really an ethically driven answer, so I'm going to be short. But yes, the capacity of people in Gaza to understand what Hamas did will be very low at the moment. And reverse, the capacity of Israelis to understand what the IDF is doing in Gaza is also very low. So there's a lot of people in Gaza who don't believe the truth of what Hamas did. And they're not going to believe it for a long time. That's quite different, interestingly, to, again, the Ukraine war, where the Russian population has a very good sense of what its country is doing in Ukraine. Nicholas is talking about how ethics in politics is used. What I would say is that in politics, especially in high power politics, ethical considerations are only one mode of consideration among others. And what you're looking for isn't for political decisions to be ethically motivated, actually. What you're looking for is that, on the one hand, ethics doesn't constrain politics into incapacity, and on the other hand, that ethical considerations aren't brushed out of the way too much. So it's a balance. Ethical considerations have to play a role that is not too great, because then they'll just drown political activity, but also a role that is not too small, because otherwise you get ghastliness and evil. Let's run till 45 minutes, just a little bit more. And then I'm going to do a little bit of work on the main channel video, and then crash and think of you with love. Piotr Amalfitano is right. What I tend to do in the comments, so I've banned about five people probably in a year and a half from the main channel and the chat channel together, which is very, very low. But I tend to all the bans were for very direct threats of violence or egregious sort of Borat style racism, but without the humor. In these, I think you're more at risk of getting banned if you spam like repeatedly. And here, unfortunately, the different principle, I don't even like doing this at all, but a different principle applies, which is just of interrupting the chat too much. If you do it in a palpably unconstructive way. I think, look, it can be fun to troll. It can be fun to come into a chat and say, well, look at the bunch of morons here, let's take the piss out of them. But it disrupts us, and so um, I have to be a bit responsive to this collective need of the comment section not to be too horrific here, on the chat section not to be too horrific. So I'm more tolerant in the video comments. But even there, um, I now have this new policy where if you come to a video and you say the same thing 10 times under 10 different comments, you might go. But my aim is, however I balance, is always to keep banning people to a very very bare minimum. And if you ever get banned, I mean, it's overwhelmingly unlikely you ever could, but just DM me if you think that you need a second shot because you lost the plot. Because we also, all lose the plot sometimes. When I answer comments, and I've got a health condition, so often I answer comments when I'm not physically feeling amazing. I think 1 in 10 comments that I answer, I don't answer in the way that I'm in love with. I'm not somebody who feels. I have a very healthy self-image, so I don't feel bad if I didn't answer comments ideally. I sometimes feel bad for people. So, I could have been gentler there. But 1 in 10 times I myself do not answer comments in a perfect way. There's also something sort of real about that. I mean, we're not in a shop and I'm not just a customer service person. So, but 9 times out of 10, if you are mean to me, I won't be mean back to you. But 1 time out of 10, I might be a bit mean back to you in the comments. And that's kind of life. But I think maybe I can do better. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I can do better. Maybe I can do better. Davis, how ethical is it demanding end of the war in Ukraine by giving up their territory? I have like Konstantin Kissin's article this week. I haven't read Konstantin's article. Mm, there are 2 ethical pools here. One pool says we've got to respect what Ukrainians feel and want, and a pool. And the other pool says we've got to respect our own strategic interests here. So it's ethical insofar as these 2 things are respected in your view, really. And so where I'd start with that conversation is this. Putin is on a pattern of escalation that will not stop. So Putin can't have a deal that he then reasonably can be expected to stick to. And that's a problem. Another thing that you bring into this is a conversation about Western capacity. So yes, we should ourselves about what we should do, but are we going to do it? Like realistically, what are we going to do? What are Western powers going to do? Are Western powers going to get Ukraine to retake all of their territory? Well, they're not. They're just not. Ukraine could do it, but it'd be a bonus outcome. It wouldn't be a part of Western strategy. So you've got to put all of this in the pot and then judge. But what's hard is that, and people hate the term proxy, but I think there's such a thing as a positive proxy. I think Ukraine is positively a proxy of the United States. And I use that term because it's very empathetic toward Ukraine. In other words, really grasp this feeling of we're fighting an existential fight, but that fight is dependent on a tap that is dependent on the democratic wash of another country. So what's happening in domestic American politics is going to control a tap that heavily dictates our existential fight for freedom. And that's a very vulnerable place in which to be, a very uncertain place in which to be. And so you've got to take into account how Ukrainians feel, what they need, what they think they need, and do that pluralistically. Ukrainians don't all agree with each other. They don't all agree with each other. Folks who are in the trenches do not have all the same views that folks on Twitter have. And you've got to be strategically responsible. So, yeah, what's particularly unethical is playing into Putin's hands in the way that's going to punch us in the face. And I do think that we're in a difficult situation because we're at risk of trending in that direction. We're at risk of having a policy that's going to get us punched in the face later. And I discussed that in the latest main channel video. But then the questions of capacity arise. How much better than this could we do? Is drifting and then maybe getting punched in the face and hopefully not the best we can do, and so on. So what I can tell you politically, I don't want to talk politics too much, is that there will be increasing pressure on Ukraine to increasingly consider kinds of compromise they don't want to consider. But the trouble is that when the West will be doing that, it won't be backing it up with a strategy of its own about how to resolve this problem, which is still, for me, not a Ukraine problem. It's a problem of a wider pattern of escalation by Putin that could punch us in the face. 3.2% of the answer you need, but that's just some reflections. I'll follow the sun. Thanks for being kind. So, I reckon I'll take one more question from Bidelovibrio. How do you connect your ethics to your politics? Enormously interesting question, and I can't take it on, so I'll just make a little note of it. With an example. Immigration. Very controversial example. I think immigration will be one of the biggest issues of the migration will be one of the biggest issues of the 21st century. We're going to have enormous numbers of people desperately moving across borders on a scale we have never encountered before. And my personal attitude is that, if you took my street and entirely populated it with, I don't want to say Ukrainian folks, because Ukrainians tend to be nicely welcomed in Europe, but with Syrians and Palestinians, I would be in love. I would be in love. That replaced the Brits and whoever else around me. My street would be exciting, sense of community. I'd love it. But that's not how all my fellow citizens feel. And so politically, in the 21st century, and this was different in the 90s perhaps, but today I have the belief that it's very dangerous to bring people into a country without laying really good groundwork around persuading the population to be okay with it. One of the big risks is you bring people in without persuading your population of it. And that can dramatically affect trust in politics, trust in institutions. can send your country into a toxic spiral of democratic degeneration, which then creates an even worse policy for people coming into the country. So here is a clash between my ethical disposition, which is very strongly welcoming of people coming into any country I live in, and my political disposition that is very fearful of over prioritizing my own instincts about this, unless I realize that my fellow citizens agree, and I know they don't. And so I don't really think many policies today are helpfully discussed in terms of left and right. Sometimes they are, but my ethical disposition is much more left, if you like, on this particular policy, and my political attitude is not. And there's a conflict there. So that's an example. That's an example of a clash. In other words, that I have a political opinion that says that we've reached a point where having a human rights-based immigration policy degrades our democracy. And we've got to find a way of having a situation where we have as much of a human rights-friendly immigration policy as possible without degrading our democracy. I have some solutions for that I've stolen from a few writers and thinkers. And that's to try to argue for people coming in, not on the basis of universal principles and human rights, but on the basis of ideas like generosity, guests, welcoming, and blah, 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 blah. So the language of the gift, not the language of the right. That comes from Michael Ignatieff largely, who is a public intellectual I admire, and am interconnected with him in interesting ways because the book I'm writing is on a man whose biography he wrote. So that's an example. That's an example of a tension where my political judgment overrides my personal disposition. That's less than 0.5% of an answer to what you're talking about, but just a flavor. Monsieur, nothing. Many take moral stances that are correct or not that aren't effective in politics. I agree with that. Like not voting because they're all bad and they rationalize this as effective. Yeah. I mean, I do. I'm a big fan, obviously, of political participation in Western democracies. If you're in a Western democracy and you have the brain power to participate, the bandwidth to participate, you're not too stressed or overwhelmed by politics, then you've got to do it. Everybody, it's been a complete and utter privilege to be briefly with you. And I'm going to see you, I reckon on Monday on the main channel. If the miracle occurs, maybe tomorrow. Amalfitano, I'm so grateful. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Lots and lots and lots of love. And talk very, very soon. Bye-bye for now. With all my gratitude.